I was grading spelling tests with a red marker when my entire life changed. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October. The classroom smelled like dry erase markers and the apple cinnamon candles my CO teacher kept on her desk. 22 first graders were at their tables working on handwriting worksheets. I was sitting cross-legged on the reading rug, a stack of papers in my lap, when my phone buzzed in my cardigan pocket. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I almost didn't answer, but something made me swipe right. A man's voice, calm and careful, asked if I was Marigold Elaine Calloway. I told him yes, though no one had called me by my full name since my grandmother used to say it when she was pretending to scold me. He told me he was an attorney. He told me there had been an accident on Route 17 outside Knoxville. He told me my grandparents, Chester and Lorraine Calloway, were gone. I remember staring at a small paper butterfly one of my students had taped to the leg of my desk. I stared at it for a very long time. I don't remember much after that. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand what kind of family I came from. And I mean really understand it, because from the outside we looked like a postcard. I grew up in a suburb of Nashville, Tennessee. My parents, my father Douglas, and my mother Patrice, were the kind of people who cared enormously about how things looked. My father sold commercial real estate and drove a car that announced his success before he even stepped out of it. My mother chaired the neighborhood beautification committee, organized fundraising luncheons, and made sure our Christmas lights were up before anyone else on the block. I have a brother, Brandon, 2 years older. He was the kind of son my parents had always hoped for. He was tall, confident, and had learned at a young age how to make my father laugh. He played golf by the time he was 12. He knew how to work a room. I was quieter. I liked books and thunderstorms and helping things grow. I was the child who asked too many questions about the wrong things and not enough about the right ones, at least according to my mother. At the dinner table, I was largely background noise. The only place I ever truly exhaled was at my grandparents' house in the foothills outside Knoxville. Chester and Lorraine had built a trucking and logistics company, Callaway Freight Solutions, from nothing, literally nothing. My grandfather started with one borrowed truck and a route that took him from Knoxville to Charlotte and back, sleeping at rest stops to save money on motels. He had a 6th-grade education and more integrity than anyone I have ever met in my life. Their house was small and a little crooked and smelled like coffee and wood smoke. My grandmother had tomato plants along the back fence. My grandfather had a workshop where he'd let me hand him tools and explain what every single one was for. My father was embarrassed by them. He called their neighborhood the Holler, even though it wasn't. He made comments at holiday dinners quiet, cutting remarks about their truck in the driveway or my grandmother's coupon clipping. He would never say it directly, but the message was clear. These people were beneath us. Forget that they had paid for the house we lived in. Forget that they had handed my father a down payment on his first commercial deal without blinking. Forget that every time my father's business stumbled, it was Chester and Lorraine who quietly caught him. They never complained about it. Not once. Not to me. I spent my summers there. My grandmother taught me to make biscuits from scratch and to sew a straight hem and to look people in the eye when they were talking to you. My grandfather taught me that a deal done on a handshake from a person with integrity was worth more than any contract. He taught me that the people who work the hardest are usually the ones most people don't notice, and that a good leader notices them first. When I told my parents I wanted to be a teacher, my mother set her fork down slowly, the way she did when she was composing herself. "Marigold," she said, "you have options." My father just said, "We're not paying for that." And they didn't. My grandparents did, without hesitation. My grandmother sent me a card the week I started my education program. She wrote in her looping cursive, "We are so proud of you. The world needs more people who show up for children. You are going to be wonderful." I kept that card in my wallet for years. I still have it. I became a first-grade teacher in a public school in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. My apartment was small and my car had rust along the wheel wells and I ate a lot of pasta and I loved my life. My students were everything. On hard days I would remind myself of what my grandfather had told me, "Do your work like it matters, Annie girl," because it does. My parents called occasionally. When they did, it was usually to mention something Brandon had accomplished, or to remind me that my cousin was getting married and I needed to buy something appropriate to wear. They never asked about my classroom. They never asked about my kids. Every Sunday I drove to Knoxville for dinner. For 9 years I never missed a Sunday unless I was sick. The funeral was everything the rest of my family was, polished, performative, and hollow. My mother wore a hat. My father gave a eulogy that was more resume than remembrance. Brandon stood in the receiving line and accepted condolences with a practiced sadness he had not earned. Extended family I hadn't seen in years filled the pews, murmuring about what wonderful people Chester and Lorraine had been, which would have been more moving if any of them had bothered to visit in the last decade. I stood in the back and cried, and nobody noticed. 2 weeks later, we were called to the offices of an attorney named Gerald Fitch. His office was in downtown Knoxville, on the 4th floor of a building with a view of the Tennessee River. Everything in it was polished and quiet. My father sat in his chair like a man who had already mentally redecorated the room. My mother's hands were folded in her lap, nails painted a dark plum. Brandon had driven 2 hours for this and could not stop glancing at the door like something better might walk through it. Gerald Fitch read through the standard language. I barely heard any of it. I was staring at a framed photo on the wall, a river, fog, morning light. I was trying not to fall apart. Then Gerald said, "The entirety of the estate, including all shares of Callaway Freight Solutions, the property at 4412 Ridgeline Road, and all liquid and investment accounts valued at an estimated $31 million is bequeathed to one person." The room shifted. Marigold Elaine Callaway is the sole beneficiary. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. My father's face went through several stages in the span of about 4 seconds. Disbelief, confusion, rage. "Run that back," he said, and his voice was very, very controlled. Gerald did not run it back. He slid the document across the desk. My mother's composure cracked first. "This is a joke," she said, and there was nothing gracious about it. They were old. She was over there every Sunday filling their heads with the anticipated questions about their capacity. Gerald said calmly. He turned his laptop around. They recorded a message. I saw my grandparents on the screen. They were sitting on their couch, the one with the faded blue flowers that I had sat on 1,000 times. My grandfather had his hand over my grandmother's. They looked older than I remembered, but their eyes were clear and sharp and absolutely present. My grandfather spoke first. "Well, if you're seeing this, then we're gone, and I hope we didn't leave too big a mess." Lorraine picked out what to wear, so at least the caskets were tasteful. My grandmother smiled and elbowed him. Even then, they made me laugh through tears. "We made this choice with clear heads and full hearts," my grandmother said, looking into the camera. "We thought a long time about what legacy means, and we realized it doesn't mean money. It means values. It means what you leave behind and the people who carry you forward." My grandfather cleared his throat. "Douglas and Patrice, we love you. You're our children, but there is a difference between love and trust, and we learned that difference over many years. We watched how you treated this family, how you treated this money, and how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you. We saw you." My grandmother looked directly into the lens, and we saw Marigold. She came every Sunday for 9 years. She sat with us. She never asked for anything. She laughed at your grandfather's terrible jokes and helped me with the garden and called just to call. She is the keeper of this family's heart. And so, she will be the keeper of what we built. The screen went dark. I will not describe in detail what happened in that room after the video ended, except to say that it was not brief and it was not quiet. My father used words I will not repeat. My mother wept in a way that had nothing to do with grief. Brandon looked at me with a contempt so pure it was almost clarifying. They summoned me to my parents' house that evening. I went because some part of me still believed there might be something salvageable. There wasn't. My father had paperwork drawn up, a transfer of administrative control. They would manage the estate. I would receive a generous allocation. He used those exact words of 15%. "You're a first-grade teacher," my mother said, as if that were a diagnosis. "You cannot run a multi-million-dollar company. This is the responsible choice, Marigold. This is us protecting you." I looked at the papers on their coffee table. I thought about my grandmother's voice on that screen. She is the keeper of this family's heart. "No," I said. They escalated. Brandon slammed a cabinet. My father told me that if I walked out of that house without signing, I was done. No holidays, no calls, no family. Dead to them. I walked out. I learned within the hour that my father owned my apartment building. He had always owned it through a shell company, Crestview Property Holdings LLC, and I had never known. A text came through, a formal eviction notice, effective by midnight. I packed what I could, clothes, books, the letters my grandparents had sent me over the years, the quilt my grandmother had made when I started college, hand-sewn from scraps of her house dresses, and my grandfather's old flannels, and a square from my childhood Halloween costume. As I carried my last box out, my father was standing on the sidewalk. He told me I had been an accident. He told me they had been happy before I came along. He said I had done nothing but complicate his life. I got in my car. I drove toward Knoxville. Gerald Fitch was on my grandparents' porch the next morning with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of biscuits from the bakery in town. He tried my phone all night. When I didn't answer, he said he'd figured I'd ended up where I belonged. He came inside and sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me what my grandparents had spent the last 4 years building. A folder, then another. My grandmother's journals, documenting every loan my father had taken and never repaid. Every time he had called them fools behind their backs. Every time my aunt had cried poverty and then posted vacation photos on Facebook. Copies of a $240,000 loan to my father, co-signed by my grandfather 5 years ago, that had never been paid back, and that my father had been hiding from his own business partners. And then Gerald opened his laptop and showed me the security footage 2 days after the funeral. My father and mother had let themselves into the house with a spare key. On camera, my mother went straight to the bookshelf in the hallway, slid out a false-backed panel, and opened the small fireproof lockbox behind it. She took out my grandmother's pearl earrings, the garnet brooch she wore every Christmas, a gold locket that had belonged to my great-grandmother. My father stood at the window with his arms crossed. My grandparents had installed the system specifically because they were afraid of exactly this. They had thought of everything. Medical certifications confirming their full mental competence signed within 6 months of their passing. Affidavits from their pastor, their doctor, their neighbor of 31 years. They had built a fortress, and then they had handed me the keys. Over the following days, they came the people my grandparents had trusted, the ones who had been quietly standing by, waiting to help. Dolores, my grandmother's best friend of 40 years, who brought a second journal and enough casserole to feed a small town. Hector, who had worked in my grandfather's fleet garage for 22 years and had heard my father on the phone one afternoon screaming that my grandfather was a stingy old man just waiting to die. Warren, my grandfather's business partner, who spread the financial records across the kitchen table with quiet fury. And Judge Sandra Beaumont, who had grown up down the road from my grandparents and who showed up in a blazer and said simply, "Chester called in every favor I owe him. Let me return it." When my father, mother, and brother arrived the next morning, expecting to find me alone, expecting to find me small, they found that kitchen table full of people. They found a retired judge. They found a former county sheriff deputy who was now a neighbor and a friend. They found the business partner with the financial records laid out in neat, devastating order. My father tried his usual performance. He pointed at me and called me manipulative. He called it a circus. Gerald let him finish. Then he turned on the laptop. They watched themselves on the security footage. My mother went perfectly still. Warren placed the loan documents on the coffee table. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when everyone in it knows that the argument is over. I looked at my father for the first time in my life. I saw him clearly not the authority figure I had spent 30 years trying to please, but a frightened, greedy man who had never once asked himself what kind of person he was becoming. "You didn't come here to protect me," I said. "You came here because you were afraid I would become someone you couldn't control. You spent my whole life making me feel like I wasn't enough. But the 2 people in this world who knew me best, who watched all of us for 50 years, chose me. That has to mean something to you, even if you'll never say it out loud." My father had no answer. My mother was crying in a way that, for the first time, might have been real. They left. The door closed behind them. The room exhaled. The months that followed were full. Gerald guided me through the legal process with patience and precision. Warren taught me the logistics company from the ground up. Not because I was going to run operations. He was more than capable, but because my grandfather had always believed that a leader who doesn't understand their people's work can't truly respect it. I learned what it meant to manage a fleet. I learned what it cost a driver to spend a week away from their family. I learned why my grandfather had always kept a coffee pot on in his office and an open-door policy. I found in the file something my grandparents had been quietly drafting for 2 years. The bones of a foundation. The Chester and Lorraine Calloway Community Fund. Their vision was specific and unpretentious. Scholarships for first-generation college students in rural East Tennessee. School supply funds for underfunded classrooms across the county. A dedicated grant for after-school arts programs. I put $8 million into it in the first year. I kept teaching. I want to be clear about that. I kept showing up every morning to 22 first graders who were learning to read and learning to share, and learning that school was a place where someone was glad they came. My wealth changed what I could do for them, but it did not change why I was there. When a child came to school in shoes that had worn through at the toe, I could do something about it. When a student showed a gift for music and her family couldn't afford lessons, we could change that. The money was not mine to keep. It was mine to move. I live in my grandparents' house now. It still smells like wood smoke and coffee. The tomato plants come back every summer. My grandfather's tools are still arranged by size in his workshop, and I have not moved a single one. On Sundays, the kitchen table is full. Dolores, Hector, Warren and his wife, Gerald, who has become something close to a surrogate uncle, teachers from my school, neighbors, a rotating, chaotic, deeply imperfect collection of people who loved the same 2 people I loved and who chose to keep showing up for each other after they were gone. These dinners are nothing like the dinners I grew up with. Nobody is performing. Nobody is keeping score. We talk too loud and laugh at things that are probably not that funny and argue about Tennessee football and eat until we can't move. This is what my grandparents left me, not $31 million. They left me proof that a life lived with integrity compounds over time. Every good thing my grandfather did, every fair deal, every worker he treated with dignity, every neighbor he helped without being asked, came back. Not to him. He never needed it to come back to him. It came back to me in the form of a room full of people who had loved him and who were willing to stand up and say so when it cost something. They left me the understanding that real wealth is not what you accumulate, it is what you build in other people. It is the teacher whose classroom doesn't run out of crayons. It is the kid from a small town who gets to go to college because someone she never met decided she was worth investing in. It is Sunday dinners where nobody has to earn their seat. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you know what it's like to grow up in a house full of people who made you feel like an afterthought, I want you to know this. The people who truly see you are out there. Sometimes they're not who you expect. Sometimes they're the ones the rest of the world overlooks. And sometimes the people who were supposed to love you show you exactly who they are, and the most powerful thing you can do is believe them. Don't spend your life auditioning for people who've already made up their minds about you. Go be with the people who show up on Sundays. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me about someone who saw you when others didn't. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet subscribed, there's more to come.